Crying. It's something we've all done, but as adults, some of us roll it back to maybe just once or twice in a lifetime. For others, it happens often and freely. Let's find out a bit more about the psychology and science of crying to see if there's something we can change in our own lives. Dr. Rachel Hannam is a psychologist at North Brisbane Psychologists. Rachel, how do emotional tears differ from the tears of cutting an onion?
Good question. Well, yes, when we get dust in our eyes or we cut up an onion, we get tears, but the tears that we cry, the basal tears, don't contain endorphins and oxytocin. So there's stress hormones and neurohormones in the emotional tears.
Right. So when people say they have a good cry, it literally is a good cry because of those endorphins that are in them.
Exactly.
What's the social role played by tears?
Yeah, well, the evolutionary biologists say that tears evolved so that we can communicate without words to those who are closest to us that we're feeling intense emotions, and therefore we can get the support and comfort that we need in a very quiet sort of a way. Because you can't really see somebody crying until you get up close to them. So they believed it really did evolve for us to bond and elicit empathy and comforting behaviours.
Why do you think some people feel shame about crying?
I think it's because we have shame about experiencing very strong feelings. And if we have shame around feeling strong emotions, then, crying is certainly no way of hiding our strong emotions. In fact, this is why we cry, to help us regulate the stress that comes from really strong emotions, whether that's anger, intense anxiety, intense sadness, or even intense joy and happiness. Our nervous systems perform the function of regulating intense emotions. And if we're not okay with the fact that we're human beings with, intense emotions, then we're going to try and hide that away, even from ourselves.
One thing I've learned from you is to dive a little bit deeper into your core beliefs, where they come from. Are they coping strategies? This shame about strong emotions, do you think that comes from our British stiff upper lip culture, or where do you think it comes from?
Definitely. Some cultures, and historically especially, have been much better at accepting and regulating and even ritualizing the expression of really intense emotion. But many cultures these days, particularly Western cultures, but some other cultures as well, very much repress strong emotions if they haven't had cultural norms and rituals for dealing with the release of those emotions. If we don't know what else to do with something, we tend to hide it away and push it away.
What's the cost of trying not to cry over time, or not crying when you want to over time?
Well, it's that whatever we repress, will come out in some other form. The truth will out. Or the shadow will out, as the Jungian psychologists say. So therefore, because we're not releasing our intense emotions through some physical expression like crying, where we get the endorphins and the oxytocin, it may build up in our system and come out in other ways, through angry outbursts, through insomnia, through digestive or other health problems, or through panic attacks is also something I've seen.
Oh, that's unusual. So it's not just an emotional outlet, it comes out physically as well. So are those warning signs for us to look for if we have indigestion, if we get very angry all of a sudden, we should inquire why that suddenly happened to us?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's a very worthwhile inquiry. The body keeps the score. As we often say in psychology, there's a wonderful book by that name. And we do hold unresolved emotions in the body at some level. And if you're struggling with chronic pain, chronic digestive issues, anxiety attacks, or other very physiological body-based struggles, it's definitely worth inquiring into the unrecognized emotions that are probably underlying that from the past, echoes from the past, I should say.
Are there physical ways to let out that built-up tension aside from crying? Can you just go for a good run, go for a rock climb? Are there other things that you can do if you're not a natural crier?
Yeah. I mean, I do recommend people try and have a good cry if they can. There's a few movies I recommend to my clients sometimes to get them into their emotions.
Oh, which one do you go for?
Oh, the one that really got me was called Lion. It came out a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
Did you see Lion?
I've seen it. So the other day I watched the last scene where the emotional ending. I won't give it away, but it's a 12-minute summary of the last scene. Just the last scene on YouTube. And everyone in the comment section was like, tried to watch this without crying, unsuccessful.
Yeah. Oh, it really gets you. So I often suggest people watch that, even just that 12 minutes at the end on YouTube.
Yeah.
Because once we start crying, often we're starting to have that physical release. It can be a really good way of softening, getting back into our bodies, out of our heads, and becoming receptive to new ideas or new ways of thinking about things. Often after we have a cry, we have a big sigh and we can breathe properly again. But as you've mentioned, there are other physical releases that get us out of our head, back into our body. Having a good rock climb, having a good laugh can be good as well, although not quite the same as crying. Vigorous exercise, and sometimes people just being around people you trust, having a really good hug. I think of the movie Frozen, where Elsa hadn't mourned her parents' death and was frozen. And then at the end, when she has that big hug and a cry with her sister, I think actually a lot of old and recent fairy tales really show the value of tears and how they represent a surrender and then a shift and something changing. But yeah, we can do that through all sorts of kinds of physicality.
Is there a difference between the effect on us of a good laugh versus a good cry?
Well, both release endorphins and oxytocin in the brain and the nervous system. So that's something they have in common. So they both are a release of tension. I think, though, crying really gets us in touch with and helps us move through really intense emotions. So that's where the value is in crying. Don't get me wrong. I love a good laugh, as you know, Ashwin.
Yeah.
But I also love a good cry, and I think that very often we're tight and we're tense in a chronic way. We're anxious, we're stressed, or we're angry.
Yeah.
And the act of crying helps us soften into what's underlying that, which might be, deep sort of sadness, not surprisingly. And then our anger or vengefulness or whatever softens, and we can actually find a different power, not the power that lies in, extreme stress or anger, but in, more life-serving ways where we can, think more clearly about our options. And I think that's what crying can give us. Maybe laughing can give us that as well, but I think crying just goes to the next deeper level.
You could be right. I think, the two main types of plays since the beginning of plays were always comedies and tragedies. And I just thought, it'd be good if you could just get away with comedies. But by the sounds of it, you're saying you need the tragedies in there as well to balance them out.
Absolutely. Life is a package deal. It is full of joy and delight, as well as disappointment and deep sadness sometimes.
Rachel, I was talking about this because, some, traditions talk about eternal bliss and being happy all the time. I saw an article about the value of negative emotions, and it was saying when you're sad, there's an evolutionary reason for sadness because it encourages you to focus on a problem that the sadness is responding to. So you've got to focus.
Yeah.
Apparently people's memory sometimes is better in sadness. Their cognitive abilities improve in sadness compared to when you're happy, because happiness can bliss you out and put you into a bit of a stupor. But sadness can make you a bit sharper and remember things better. It's actually valuable. So you've got to not run away from negative emotions. They have a purpose and they have a value.
Oh, absolutely. And they are more grounding. In the joy and the delight and the excitement, we can feel a bit flighty, which is a wonderful feeling. But I think Mother Nature is very clever and has given us ways to balance things out. Luckily, life is not all vanilla and, bland and neutral.
Yeah.
And like I said, it's a package deal. So the sadness, disappointment, hurt, these sort of emotions, I wouldn't even describe them as negative. I'd describe them as maybe unpleasant, but they're telling us that we have unmet needs. We needed, expected, or wanted something, and then it didn't happen. And that's really useful information, and our emotions are, providing that information that there was something I really cared about, really wanted, really valued. It didn't happen. What was it? Sometimes it's abstract, just like respect or support or consideration or trust. And when I'm aware of that through my emotions, then I'm empowered to go and perhaps take action, have a conversation, repair a relationship, or make a different choice about something.
Yeah, that makes sense. Treat your emotions as cues telling you something and look deeper.
Mm.
You're listening now to Dr Rachel Hannam, who's a psychologist at North Brisbane Psychologists, talking about the value of crying. What role do our ideas about gender play when it comes to crying, and are attitudes changing?
I think they are changing slowly. I did some very extensive research before this interview, Ashwin, by asking my husband, who's 50, and my son, who's 15.
Yeah.
N equals 2. And my husband can remember being told growing up, stop crying. You know, he jumped off the roof and broke both his feet. He told me this story. And his father said, stop crying, probably angry that he jumped off the roof. So in the face of physical pain and emotional pain, he very much grew up seeing other boys and himself being told, stop crying, don't cry. Don't cry, I'll give you something to cry about. Whereas my 15-year-old didn't get that nearly as much. But he does remember hearing, he didn't experience it directly, which I was relieved about, but he heard other boys being told at school to stop crying and teachers treating the girls differently when they would cry from the boys. So I think it's still there. It's still a gendered issue, and we still associate crying with weakness, which is a shame.
What about differences between the age groups? What do you see there when it comes to crying?
Well, yeah, asking my 50-year-old husband and my 15-year-old son was interesting. And in my clinical work, I noticed that women are more, not always, but often more willing to shed tears in the therapy room than men, and that older clients are much less likely to feel okay about crying. And I noticed a marked difference between my generation of clients in their 40s versus, say, clients in their 60s or 70s. A big, big difference, that post-war Stoicism versus, babies of the 70s and 80s who, were given a bit more permission to express their emotions. And I think in the younger generation now, when I see clients around 18, 20 years of age, they're much more open about mental health issues and emotions. So, yeah, things are changing over the generations.
That's Stoicism. It's in men, as you say, it's encouraged in men, it's encouraged in older people. Stoicism has a value as well, I'm sure, as a philosophy and as approach to life. How do you balance Stoicism with crying?
That is such a great question because, we can indulge our emotions if we don't have the right relationship to them. And so it's like everything in life, it's a balancing act, and it's a fine line between, feeling the build-up of emotion in our bodies and in our minds and releasing that through tears and being very compassionate to ourselves rather than feeling sorry for ourselves, which is a different thing. I teach my clients to have self-compassion, not self-pity, if they find themselves crying, so that the crying takes them somewhere to that new, softer place where they can think more clearly and be a bit more relaxed. If we give our emotions too much power, then they can take over our lives and we feel powerless. However, if we don't address them at all, they're still there at some level and they will try and get a release somehow, and then we're powerless in that situation as well. So I say just experiment with finding the right balance for you between trying to think logically and rationally while also allowing yourself to be an emotional creature. They say that we are feeling creatures who think rather than thinking creatures who feel. So that's a good way to remember it as well.
That is a nice way to remember it. And it sounds like life is a constant balancing act between all these different forces. But that's just the challenge of being human. What about cultural differences in people from different ethnic backgrounds? Do you notice a difference in their approach to crying in your clinical practice?
Well, most of the non-Anglo clients that I've had have been from India. And I have found that my Indian clients, I've really enjoyed working with them because they actually have been fairly expressive and fairly willing to cry, which has been really interesting to me and quite delightful, sometimes at least. And then I've had some Chinese clients over the years who definitely struggled a lot more to acknowledge their tender and more vulnerable feelings, very stoic people from memory. And so we've got the cross-cultural differences, and I can't really speak to a very big variety of cultures. I haven't worked across cultures too much. I certainly see a difference in culture of different families. Families have their own microcultures, and class can create culture as well. So, it's always a complex combination of variables, culture, age, gender, and other factors as well.
Yeah, and it's good to explore those because that can highlight to you where your founding beliefs have come from so you can address whether they're still working for you or not.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And profession. I wanted to say something about professional groups because I find that quite a few of my clients over the years have been psychologists themselves, doctors, lawyers, that kind of thing. I think they have a belief that they should be above all of this primal human emotion. I might have come into the world crying, but I'm a 40-year-old professional now and I shouldn't cry.
Yeah.
And so they have a belief, like you say, that it's weakness, there's shame in it, it's not acceptable. And then once they overcome that belief, it's quite liberating.
Do you have a final word on tears, something we haven't covered already?
Oh, yes, I wanted to say one thing, and that is that because of the surrender and the letting go and the opening up that comes with a good cry, we end up surrendering our ego. And I think that's a really important part of crying. The ego does not want to cry. The ego often is what gets in the way. But once we get there, once we're in our tears, the ego has to take a back seat. And I think that's always a good thing because the ego tends to dominate our daily lives.
Dr Rachel Hannam, psychologist from North Brisbane Psychologists. Thanks for your time this morning.
Thanks so much, Ashwin.